Hello, everybody, and welcome to our SQUIP virtual salon on conducting qualitative research with caregivers. I see all of you saying hello and introducing yourselves in the chat. It looks like we've got a great group of people here tonight, and really looking forward to these talks and to hearing what all of you have to say. In a few minutes, I'm going to hand over the microphone to tonight's host, Jean Marashek, who will introduce tonight's presenters in the SQUIP Salon. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of an introduction to our Crowdcast platform here. As you can see, there is a chat window on the side where you can say hello to each other. You can share your reactions to the presentations as they're unfolding, anything like that. Feel free to put it in the chat window. If you are having some kind of technical difficulty, like problems hearing or seeing, you can put that in the chat window as well. We'll be monitoring. But I did want to let everybody know, if you are having any kind of technical trouble, like trouble hearing, trouble seeing, the first thing you should try is refreshing your browser window. Just go up to the browser bar, refresh, and try to come back in. And very often that'll solve the problem. If you see somebody else struggling with that in the chat, you can also let them know too. Now, if you have questions that you would like our presenters to answer during the Q&A at the end of our session, the place to put that is down at the bottom where it says ask a question. You should be able to click there and share your question with us, and then the presenters will talk about those in the Q&A at the end of the event. So thanks very much for being here. I'm going to turn the mic over to Jean Marashek.
Thank you, and welcome everybody. I'm Jean Marashek. I'm asked to do this because I'm a former president of the Society for Qualitative Inquiry in Psychology. You'll hear lots of us calling it SQUIP in the course of the evening. SQUIP is a section of the American Psychological Association's Division of Quantitative and Qualitative Methods. And I can tell you more about it, but I invite you to look on our website to find more about it. You'll also see on the website that we have videos of the virtual salons that have happened before, and there'll be a video of this one posted also, and other information. You'll see there's a button on the bottom of your screen that's called information about joining SQUIP. And I'd just like to say that despite our name, you don't have to be a member of the American Psychological Association to join. You don't need to be an American to join. You don't need to be a psychologist to join. We have a journal called Qualitative Psychology, and you don't have to be a psychologist to publish in the journal. And so we welcome you to think about both reading it and submitting your work to the journal. In normal times, we hold a yearly face-to-face conference, normally in June. But of course, these are not normal times. If they had been normal times, you would have been able to hear our four speakers tonight live and have a chance to talk to them face to face after their presentations. Of course, these are not normal times at all. But of course, the topic is just incredibly relevant to the times that we're in. Our title tonight is Conducting Qualitative Research with Caregivers. As I say, the topic could not be more timely. We're in a world, or much of the world, engulfed by the COVID pandemic, and it has certainly made us acutely aware of the profound disparate burdens of care work within families, within communities, between poorly resourced parts of the world and highly resourced parts of the world, and so on. We already knew that there were gender disparities in care work in families, and we knew that there were racial and ethnic and social class disparities in the burdens of risk shouldered by care workers, healthcare workers in the paid labor force. Now we're finding out even more in even larger scale how true that is. Our speakers tonight are dealing with diverse. Nobody is dealing, I think, nobody is going to speak directly about the COVID pandemic, but people are going to speak about caregiving in a variety of contexts for a variety of issues. The panel engages researchers who you would have heard from in June, who would have been on different panels. We put them together here for you now. Researchers from a variety of national contexts, the US, Canada, Australia, who are working with informal care workers and formal care workers. It also draws together researchers who use a variety of methods for gathering and interpreting people's lived experiences. And we certainly welcome questions that you might have that pertain to methods and methodological and analytic choices that people are making. The first speaker, who has the most difficult name to pronounce, but I've had a little coaching, Zoe Triandafilides, is a health researcher in Newcastle, Australia. She completed her PhD at Western Sydney University in 2018, and since then, she has been doing research in the areas of family and friend care work, knowledge translation, and breastfeeding. Currently, she works as a senior project officer for an institute called Every Mind, which is dedicated to reducing mental ill health, suicide, and improving well-being. The project she's presenting today is part of a larger project called Minds Together, which is a set of resources and an online program to support people who are caregivers. That work builds on an earlier program that was focused on people who were caring for or living with partners with serious depression. Zoe's talk is called Constructions of Caring for the Self and the Anxious and Depressed Other. Aaron Seaman is a medical anthropologist by training. He is in the Department of Internal Medicine at the Carver College of Medicine at the University of Iowa in the United States. He also has an affiliation with the College of Public Health. Aaron's work focuses on patient-centered studies of care management and delivery for older adults. He has worked on projects involving several disease contexts. His dissertation was on family carers for family members with early onset Alzheimer's disease. It's a very interesting study that develops the idea of how family members do nothing, quote unquote, when in fact, of course, they're doing voluminous work for their family members. Currently, he's involved in several studies involving cancer survivorship. Aaron's talk will be called Beyond Consent, Practicing Reciprocal Engagement in Caregiving Research. The third speaker is Michelle LaFrance, who is a professor of psychology at St. Thomas University, which is in Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada. Michelle's a critical feminist psychologist. Her work has focused on developing sort of thick understandings of women's distress and well-being, particularly depression. She's also made a number of important contributions to the development and interrogation of qualitative methods. One notable and much cited paper developed the idea of tightrope talk, and some of you might want to ask her what she means by that when we get to the question session. Her interest in care work emerged from her interviews with women who experience depression and who identify caregiving in their families as a central contributor to that distress. The work that she wants to talk about today, she will talk about today, is the beginning of a project that she hopes will develop into an action research project that could lead to some tangible changes in her community. Her title is called The System Isn't Broken, It Was Built That Way. And my printer has blanked out the rest of it, but I'll let her repeat the title when she speaks. Our fourth speaker is Lucas Hofstetter. He is the Research and Development Officer at Carers New South Wales. Carers New South Wales is an NGO for carers in New South Wales. They work collaboratively to lead change and action to improve the lives of carers. They provide information, support, education, training, referrals, resources, and the coordination of support for recipients who draw on the National Disability Insurance Scheme in Australia. He has also been associated with the sociology department at Macquarie University in Sydney. Most of his work has involved mixed methods. Lucas's talk is called Becoming a Carer as a Young Person, the Role of Service Access in the Construction of a Carer Identity, and How to Talk About It via Zoom. And now we're ready to start. We will go back to Zoe.
So we are now inviting to the stage Zoe Triandafilides with her talk, Constructions of Caring for the Self and the Anxious and Depressed Other.
Just confirming you can see my slides okay there. Hoping that's coming up okay. Thank you, Jean, for the wonderful introduction. I'm really excited to be part of this panel today. And thank you to everyone who helped make this possible. I'd like to begin my presentation with an acknowledgement of country. So the Awabakal and Warramai peoples are the traditional custodians of the lands and waters of Newcastle, which is where I'm presenting from today. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty here has never been ceded and that this was and always will be Aboriginal land. So late last year, I was lucky enough to receive a fellowship from the Prevention Hub, which is a joint venture between Every Mind, which is the institute I'm a part of, which Jean mentioned, and the Black Dog Institute in Sydney, Australia. And this fellowship was to investigate international best practice in mental health. So I sought expert advice and mentoring on conducting discursive analysis of accounts of caring for adults experiencing anxiety or depression symptoms. So I made contact with Professor Michelle LaFrance and Professor Linda McMullen, both of whom are part of today's session, and they both generously offered to mentor me. So sadly, due to COVID, we were unable to meet in person this year as planned, but instead we have begun working together online. So today I'm going to present the kind of early stages of our work together. I'd also like to acknowledge the contribution to this work from my Every Mind colleagues, in particular Dr. Sally Fitzpatrick, who has been the lead on this project, and also Vic and Kim, who were the staff who conducted the interviews, which I'll be talking about today. And just finally, I'd just like to give my thanks to Lucy Clippin. Lucy's an Australian illustrator and designer who I recently commissioned to do some arts-based knowledge translation, working with some of the findings from these interviews to create some illustrations to represent some of the ideas that I'll be talking about today. So they will be included on some of the slides that you will see. So just to give a brief kind of context around caring in Australia, so the Australian legislation defines caring as personal care, support and assistance to someone who has a disability, medical condition, mental illness, or someone who is frail and aged. Conservatively, we estimate there are 2.65 million Australians who provide 2.2 billion hours of care each year, but we know that these are underestimates. So today I'm going to be focusing on the qualitative component of a consultation study that was carried out at Everymind to assess the needs of carers of people experiencing depression and/or anxiety. So participants for this study were recruited through key stakeholder networks, including Carers New South Wales, and through social media as well. In order to participate in the study, participants had to be aged 16 years or over, living in Australia and providing care to an adult, and be comfortable with English. A diagnosis of the person receiving care was not a requirement for participation, but as I'll kind of come to later, most care recipients did indeed have a diagnosis. So included here is some of the text from the recruitment materials used for the study, and I've just highlighted some of the language there that was used, such as care, carers and caregivers. And I just point this out because this has implications as to who included themselves and who perhaps wasn't represented in the sample that were interviewed. And I'll return back to this at the end of my talk. So the first stage of the consultation was an online survey, and this attracted 123 respondents who were asked if they wanted to participate in an interview at the end of the survey. So from that, 22 people participated in phone interviews, and these interviews were around about 45 minutes and covered a range of topics, some of which is listed on the slides there. So participants were mostly female, aged on average 48 and born in Australia. Most were married or in de facto relationships and caring for their partners. Although you can see there were a range of caring relationships represented in these interviews, including people caring for children and parents. People receiving care were slightly more likely to be male and aged on average 53 years. So these were the caring roles described by the carers who participated. And despite not being a criteria for participation, most care recipients had a diagnosis of depression and/or anxiety. Participants were asked about how long they had been caring, and it was really interesting that many participants resisted this quantification of their caring journeys. They referred to the episodic nature of their caring roles, describing it as being on and off. They said it was hard to know when they had become a carer, saying it's not as if a light suddenly got switched on and suddenly I was a carer. So as I mentioned previously, the interviews were conducted by other members of the team, and then they were transcribed verbatim. So my job when I joined the team was to integrity check the interviews. So I listened to the audio of the interviews and I made edits to the transcripts, de-identified them, and made notes about some of the thoughts and ideas I had. I then uploaded all the transcripts into NVivo, and I went through the transcripts line by line, identifying semantic and latent codes. So now that I've coded all the data, I've begun asking questions, and there's 3 questions I'm going to focus on today. The first being, what does it mean to be a carer? What does it mean to be a good carer? And what does it mean to take care of yourself? So we're interested in these questions and the implications that these constructions have for participants' subjectivity, their caring practices, and the way in which they engage with support. So in regards to this first question, what does it mean to be a carer? Participants spoke about the relationship between carer identities and other identities that they held. You can see in this first quote here, the participant says, "What's caring and what's just being married?" Drawing our attention to the similarities that can occur between these two roles that they hold. Again, in this second quote, the participant says, "I'm not listed as a carer, so to speak. My role is to care for everyone in the house as the woman of the house." And here they're positioning caring as being part of this existing role, gendered role that they have as a woman. In this third quote, however, the participant says, "I'm a single mum and a carer. I have been caring for," and they name their care recipient, "since he was 4, 5, 6. So they're differentiating between these two roles and the length of time that she's occupied these two roles. Being a mum and being a carer are two separate things. Some participants resisted being a carer and taking on that identity. In this first quote here, you can see the participant talks about making a conscious decision to be caring, but to actively distance themselves from being a carer of their partner. And they say, because the way he was progressing and improving, I could preserve that element of that relationship and have it go back to a romantic relationship rather than a dependent relationship. So in this account, it seems as if the participant is resisting taking on this carer identity due to the implications for her partner, and there's this reluctance to position him as being dependent on her because of, I guess, the implications that would have for their romantic relationship. Participants spoke about what it meant to qualify or meet the criteria for a carer. So in this account here, you can see that receiving a carer's pension is often considered to officially make you a carer. So just as a side note, in Australia, to be eligible for carer payment, a claimant must be providing constant care in the home of the person being cared for. So we can see how the participant then tries to resist this definition of an official carer, saying, "I had been caring for him prior to that, but I was working, so I've always been a carer for him." In this account, she then goes on to talk about being encouraged by her GP to apply for a carer's pension. And then we see the implications for her for adopting this caring role. And she reports feeling quite guilty about taking this step, and it's unclear about whether these implications are for monetizing that receipt of money for her caring role, or if it's because of the implications for her relationship with her partner. Sorry, for her father. In this account here, we can see this participant also positions themselves as not qualifying or meeting the criteria of a carer, but instead they describe themselves as a supporter. So there's a couple of different ways in which they point out that they don't meet the criteria for a carer. They say their partner's not as bad as some people. He doesn't experience suicidal ideation. She also positions her caring as too inconsistent. She describes it going up and down. And she also talks about a carer being someone who cares for someone who is aging. That's the context in which she's associated that term. So when it comes to the question of what it means to be a good carer, for many participants, a good job of caring was said to be giving everything you have to give. In this first quote, the participant talks about being a complete and total carer, everything, caring for her grandmother in absolutely every single way. The only time I really have off is when I'm asleep. In the second quote, the participant is asked how many hours they spend per week caring for their partner, and they say, like 3, not very many, I should spend more. The implication being here that this carer isn't doing enough. They should be doing more. And doing more and doing the most is what makes a good carer. In this account here, the participant is actually resisting this notion that a good carer gives everything. They say, we're not doing a great job because it's a bit all-consuming. However, the participant takes up a position of failing to resist this discourse around complete self-sacrifice, saying, we haven't done it terribly well. So they're saying a good job of caring is actually when it's not all-consuming, but they've failed to achieve this. In the second quote, the participant positions becoming a good carer as being a non-linear journey. They say, sometimes I think I do a better job now than what I did a couple of years ago, but then other times I don't. So there's not some final destination you arrive at where you're a good carer. It's quite like the caring role, it goes up and down. So this third final question, what does it mean to care for yourself? Participants constructed self-care as a way to make themselves a better carer. So in the first quote, the participant talks about looking after themselves more. That way I can hopefully help their care recipient more. In the second quote, if I don't look after myself, I can't possibly look after anyone else effectively. So in these accounts, care for the self is positioned as being a way to improve their performance in their caring role. Some participants resisted this discourse that self-care is selfish. In this quote, the participant says, look after yourself first. It didn't come straight away. You don't always believe that because you're carrying a lot of guilt, a lot of shame. I'm getting more selfish in a good way. And this account highlights the challenge of resisting discourse that caring for yourself is selfish and the kind of implications of that, so the guilt and the shame. So to finish, I'd just like to reflect on some of the ideas that, in this early stage of analysis that have kind of been running through these questions of what it means to be a carer, what it means to be a good carer, and what it means to take care of yourself. And one of those is the episodic nature of caring for someone experiencing mental ill health, this kind of non-linear journey that people experiencing mental ill health and their families and friends go on. There's also this idea of doing enough to qualify as a carer, not doing enough to meet that criteria, and also this pressure to give until there's nothing left to give, for it to be all-consuming. And then there's these ideas around guilt and shame coming up commonly. So I'd just like to quickly acknowledge that the voices included in this study were predominantly Anglo-Australian. They were carers of people who have mostly a diagnosis of depression or anxiety, and people who were already connected with supports and services by and large. So I think further research is required here to understand how caring for the self and others is constructed by people who support someone who has symptoms of depression or anxiety, but perhaps no diagnosis. And these are people who would most likely not respond to advertisements like what we put out using this language of care and carers and caregivers. And just finally, to wrap up, because apologies, I know I'm probably a little bit over time, this work, as I mentioned earlier, is consultation informing this online program that we've developed, which we've just done a small feasibility study of, and we'll be doing a larger RCT next year. So I'm happy to chat about that later if anyone has any questions, but thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Zoe. Next up, we are inviting to the stage Erin Seaman, who will be giving a talk titled Beyond Consent, Practicing Reciprocal Engagement in Caregiving Research.
Hello all, I'm gonna pull up my screen here to share. Hopefully this will work. Or it won't, and will it work? Elizabeth, I apologize.
Okay. That's okay. Give it a little bit more of a go, and then if we can't get it working, I can run your slides for you. I'll call them up. Just in
Perfect.
case.
Do you mind? I'm gonna try and refresh one time and see if that helps.
Yep. Any luck?
You know, I think I could share my entire screen. Maybe.
I can also
If
here.
you-
Let's try this.
Are you okay doing that?
Let's see. Now I'm having trouble calling up the slides. That's strange. I was able to do it before. All right, let me try this one more time. Thanks for your patience while we get this sorted out, everybody. All right, I've got your slideshow going. So I should be able to share it. Ah, there we go. Do you see it?
Ah, yes.
All right, terrific. So just let me know when I should move between slides.
Yeah, I apologize. Are you okay doing that?
Oh, totally fine.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you, everybody. Today, I am going to be talking or giving a talk entitled Beyond Consent, Practicing Reciprocal Engagement in Caregiving Research. Of course, as aspirational titles change between the moment they're given and the moment they're presented, it looks a little different at this point, but I think it still hopefully gets in that direction. I'd like to acknowledge initially my co-author and co-conspirator in thinking about quite a bit of this, Alana Bush, an anthropologist I've known for a number of years and was lucky enough to join at Iowa a couple of years ago. So next slide, please. So today we're going to talk about three quick things, sort of caregiving in general and how I am thinking and talking about it. Then looking at taking that caregiving into people's homes and elsewhere and thinking about that. And then in the last part, thinking about consent and potentially some other issues. So next slide. So the first section will be on caregiving. Next slide. So I just want to, I like to start with this quotation from Joan Tronto, a feminist ethicist who's done a lot of work on care and care ethics, as I'm sure many of you have encountered and read. She and a colleague sort of some time ago now brought this definition of care. On the most general level, we suggest that caring be viewed as a species activity that includes everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex, life-sustaining web. I use this as a starting point, both to point to larger scholarship in which this work is embedded and to which it is indebted, of feminist ethics and approach to care, and particularly a Marxist feminist sensibility that really seeks to embed it in a political economy. I think it's also nice because it is acknowledging of the reproductive work that care is, as Alana Bush has called it, the generative labor, that it is work, that it is labor. The idea that this care involves bodies, it's inward seeking, it is relational in terms of selves and others, and it's relational in terms of environment, social, material and built worlds and otherwise. And then last, right, that it is a web of relations that is being looked at. It's always more than 2 points. It is 2 points embedded. So next slide, please. So caregiving, sort of thinking about a starting point for it. It often is viewed as extraordinary labor, that which is, as others have said, exceeding the bounds of what is normative or usual in family relationships. It's the provision of extraordinary care. Schultz and Martyr have called it. Caregiving involves, right, roles that people take on, sometimes thought of as identities or careers in different traditions. It involves series of tasks and activities. There are different stages to it, right, as caregiving progresses, as needs change. There are formal and informal caregivers, sort of as the labor force is divided between often those seen as professional caregivers and those seen as family or friend caregivers. And this is, all of this is rooted in the US and our particular history. This in particular, I feel is true to our history. Caregiving is viewed as not new, but newly problematic. Many sort of review articles or chapters or discussions or even histories of caregiving talk about the idea that people have always cared for each other, but that it's something new in this moment. So going to the next slide. As an anthropologist, I like to widen that lens a little bit and think of it, caregiving in particular, as a socio-historical formation of knowledge, practices, relations, and morality. That is, that this is a particular moment in time when caregiving as a thing has come into being and taken on a particular meaning. As I noted a couple slides earlier, it's embedded in particular political, economic contexts, which many people have written about and written well. It's a form of reproductive labor. Caregiving also is co-constituted with the conditions for which people are giving care. So in the work that I do with people with Alzheimer's disease, caregiving takes on a particular formation because it is occurring in the context of Alzheimer's disease, which is different from other contexts. It occurs in media res, right? So these are people with histories, as we heard in Zoe's presentation just a moment ago, the interviewee who said, what's caring and what's being married, right? How do you draw those lines? These people bring particular histories to the act of caregiving. And then it's relational, again, to oneself, to the social world, to material relations. And it happens between people. Caregiving is something that happens in the spaces between people and places. So next slide, please. I just want to mention quickly, for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to be talking mostly about caregiving research in the context of Alzheimer's disease, which I refer to as Alzheimer's disease rather than dementia, because I'm particularly interested in caregiving in the relationship under the discursive umbrella of Alzheimer's disease, which is particularly powerful in the US. And then I've also started recently doing work with caregivers and cancer survivorship, which provides an interesting comparative case in some ways. So next slide. So now we'll transition to talking about in people's homes and elsewhere. We can go right to the next slide. So this is a picture of a support group, and as with, I feel, research on caregivers and people in dementia, that's where mine started. I connected with a support group for people with early onset dementia and their spouses in 2009, and began working with them at that point, attending their meetings. As I attended their meetings, I became interested in thinking about how knowledge is produced and where expertise comes from, and if there is a thing such as caregiving expertise, how is it developed and how does one take it on? And so that led me to, next slide, moving into a clinical context where I started working in a memory clinic, trying to tease out how people created or talked about caregiving and created caregiving expertise or marshaled that expertise in clinical examinations. What became interesting or apparent to me across both those contexts was that despite occurring in medical settings and clinical settings, that so much of the conversation was about domestic life and spaces. And so fairly quickly, I transitioned to, next slide, please, going into the home and using the home as a way to center the research and my ethnographic experience. And I'm seeing now in the picture that you can see me in that reflection taking that picture. Anyway, so centering it around the house does a couple things. It reveals the mundane in a way that otherwise can't be seen, I feel. For example, there's a portion of my work that centers around analysis around somebody putting a shoe on another person as they're preparing to go out the door. And so thinking about that moment and how that moment plays out, that would have looked really different outside the home. The home is a nice place because it's a place to sort of longitudinally view these things playing out. And then you get to see a lot about how the different relations, the social relations and the material relations in particular play out, what it means for caregiving to come into being within a space. Next slide. I should say in the midst of that, right, I sort of embedded that in a larger framework of a lot of different places where caregiving came up. And obviously it comes up across, and the home as a place where care happens comes up across the literature, comes up across scales, measuring things like activities of daily living or caregiver burden. Comes up in the memory clinic and the support group and at conferences as well. Next slide. So generally what I did quickly, the centerpiece of my research for this project was 26 months of ethnographic field work in the early 2010s, from 2011 to 2013. I conducted observation in 6 families' homes. This meant I spent many days and nights with them over the period of about a year. During that time, I also went to 2 different memory clinics and 2 different support groups, both with members of these families and separate from them. And as well other medical and clinical spaces, which were remarkably limited, I should say, as to where these families went. Although along with clinical spaces like an exam room, one could include long-term care facilities and even day programs that people went to. I also went to several conferences and trainings, both for caregivers and care professionals. I conducted interviews and informal conversations with a number of families, 23 families in total above and beyond the 6. And I conducted between 2 and 10 interviews with these family members. I should say too, I primarily worked with spousal caregivers. And then I collected archival material as well, sort of the standard, I would say, ethnographic bag. So next slide. So now I just want to talk about beyond thinking about consent, and thinking specifically about consent in people's homes. I want to start with, next slide, a couple quick, I'm going to try and move through these sections really quickly. I did a lot of laying out of consent and what that means, and how it gets defined. The one quote I'm going to point to here that I think is really interesting is from a paper from 2003, where they described it as the necessary ethical justification for action that affects others, and it just the broad brilliance of that. I really like that as a way to think about it. You know, and often the next quote was about patients in a medical setting, and the action that is there was a medical procedure. That often when we think about consent, at least when I think about consent, I think about it in terms of, or I should say the IRB thinks about it in terms of bodily intrusion, and to a somewhat lesser extent, a psychic or psychological intrusion. But what was interesting about working in people's homes, right, is that it was a space intrusion. The next slide outlines the informed. I received this email today as I was going through this, so added it. No, you were right on the informed consent one, Elizabeth. I apologize. This one, yes, about what it means to have informed consent and a consent process. But I will skip that for now. This is all very IRB template-y language, which often I feel like for many people with whom I work and whom I encounter in research, informed consent is an IRB hurdle more than other things. So next slide. So we can think about what consent is intended to do, right? It's intended to communicate information about a series of things, about what the study is about, what will be done, what the procedures are, information about your role as a subject or participant or informant, that your role is voluntary. It is to communicate understanding back from the study participant to the researcher, and ensure that understanding is complete. It is to ensure autonomy, and it is to document the decision of consent or not. Right, that's sort of, I think, how it's envisioned, what its roles are. However, next slide, please. It also does a lot of other things. And this, like I say here, is just a partial list. It evaluates capacity, right, which in the context of dementia is both worth considering and well considered, I think, at this point, although not always well answered. It conveys roles, expectations, and boundaries. It says you are the study participant and I am the study researcher. That both establishes credibility and institutional support for the researcher, provides some institutional support for the research subject in terms of a potential recourse should they feel something was done wrong. It also reproduces, however, the power dynamics between them in ways that at this point in the US, for people engaged in medical research, feel very familiar and therefore probably feel pretty natural. And it happens at a single point in time and from a single point of view. There's a lot that it doesn't take into account. I'm going to skip the next slide because I know that I am just about at my 18 minutes. Process consent is a model developed by Jan Dewing that has a lot to do with thinking about the ongoing process of consent that is necessary for somebody with dementia or memory loss, and what that looks like. And Alana and I have started to think about it in terms of reciprocal engagement. And I think the big thing that I want to point to here is that as qualitative researchers, we are particularly well positioned to do this kind of reciprocal engagement, to be attentive to not just a person's cognitive capacity, but also the multiple parties that are involved, the intimacies, particularly in a person's home, that are being encountered, how space changes that, and again, the power dynamics that are brought about in research relationships. I'm going to end there because I don't want to take anybody else's time, and say thank you, and hopefully be able to talk about that a little more. Thank you all.
Erin, thank you very much. That was wonderful. Now we are going to invite up our next presenter. I'm just calling her to the stage right now. Next up, we are going to hear from Michelle LaFrance with her talk, "The System Isn't Broken, It Was Built That Way, Informal Caregiver Strain in Context." Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you. I'm just confirming that everything's working. And thank you for doing the slides. Elizabeth?
I'm just going to take a second to get those set up because I need to transition from Erin's.
Sure. And while you're doing that, I just want to acknowledge my collaborators, so Lynn Gallagher and Carmen Poulet, and some honor students who worked on this portion of this project, Cassandra Swift, Valerie Godet, and Maura Kinney.
Can you see?
I can see.
Terrific.
Thank you. So you can go forward there on the slide. Thanks, Elizabeth. So this study explores the experiences of informal caregivers of older adults. And these are the spouses, adult children, families, members, and friends who do the day-to-day activities that many older adults need to continue to live well at home. So this can include the daily tasks of cleaning, cooking, shopping, and paying bills, to the very physical and intimate work of bathing, administering medications, and performing other medical treatments. And while the work can certainly be rewarding, it's also associated with a host of challenges, and caregivers reliably report very high rates of depression, as well as reduced overall mental and physical health. When we look at explorations of caregiver burden in the literature, it's often couched in quite individualistic terms. So in terms of things like level of dependence, financial strain, and all too often couched in rather pathologizing terms. One recent article described stressed caregivers as having, quote, insufficient knowledge and immature coping mechanisms. And of course, interventions rooted in this frame tend to target the individual by providing information or bolstering coping strategies. While this can be useful, and there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, what's missing, I think, very often from the picture is the larger institutional or political context of care, and how, with a view to kind of affecting more systemic change. And that's what I wanted to do in this study. Next slide, Elizabeth. To do this, I'm exploring a new interdisciplinary methodology. And we're in the middle of this analysis, but I'm exploring the psychosocial ethnography of the commonplace, or PSEC, which was developed by sociologist Lynn Gallagher and psychologist Carmen Poulet to investigate the ways in which private, individual troubles are rooted in social or political structures. So it combines influences from Dorothy Smith's institutional ethnography with psychological understandings of schema theory, which I'm interpreting in terms of discourse. Importantly, this methodology is designed specifically to mobilize research findings for social change, and so it really worked with what I was looking to do. And PSEC has been used in a variety of projects, too numerous to name here, but I'll just give you a sense. There's been work done with women police officers, women firefighters, partners of lesbian and gay soldiers, and women from First Nations communities in Canada who have left abusive relationships. Elizabeth, can you just click? It'll stay on this slide, but so I'll describe the steps that they lay out for PSEC, but as often, of course, the case with qualitative research, the process isn't linear, but fluid and circular. The first step in this analytic process is interviewing members of groups who have been marginalized in some way and conducting a thematic analysis on the challenges they face. So a central step is identifying organizational moments. So I'll read the definition here to make sure I get it correct. So organizational moments are ordinary, everyday events that participants face that are born out of institutional practices, policies, rules, or regulations. So these are things that serve the needs of organizations, but complicate the lives of individuals who have to operate within the parameters of those organizations. So here we're really looking at the complications that people come up against when they're trying to work within a system. We then look at how people make sense of and cope with these complications and develop recommendations for change based on this. Next slide, please. I was just gonna. So we interviewed 44 informal caregivers in New Brunswick, Canada, and New Brunswick, as the diagram shows there, is on the Atlantic coast bordering Maine, and we're a similar size, a bit smaller. We are a largely rural region with 3 city centers, each with populations between 60 and 85,000. We're Canada's only officially bilingual province of English and French, and we conducted interviews in both languages. Can you go forward? Staying on the slide, thank you. Participants were mostly women, as is often the case with caregiving. The ages ranged between 30 and 90. We had a mix of urban and rural, with the urban being rather small for urban, and representing a wide range economically and educationally. The older adults that they cared for had a range of conditions that required support. So about half had dementia, but the list also includes Parkinson's disease, stroke, cancer, schizophrenia, and the general frailty that can sometimes accompany advanced age. Our interviews were conducted, we conducted the interviews between 2017 right up to the COVID shutdown in March. And I should say that during this time, I too became the sole caregiver for my father, who has recently been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Next slide, please. Throughout participants' accounts, it was really clear that they struggled in navigating our home and healthcare systems. In Canada, we do have universal healthcare, but senior care, including long-term care or nursing homes, don't fall under that system. So instead, there are several different government departments and organizations that are involved. And I think it's really worth noting that this represents quite a change for Canadians who have grown up always having had free or healthcare, and then all of a sudden what feels like healthcare, so nursing home care or home care, is not under the same system, and it is not necessarily covered. And so instead we have this patchwork of public and private, for-profit and not-for-profit. And it's this opaque, disjointed, and confusing system itself that I've identified as the organizational moment. Several equated navigating the healthcare system to being a second or third job on top of their paid work or caregiving responsibilities. So for instance, Diane was caring for her father with Alzheimer's and her mom who had had a stroke. And she described how challenging it was to figure out how to get help by offering a hypothetical situation. And she said, and if you could advance the slide, she said, "Where are you going to find out? You're the daughter and you have to put your mom in a home, okay?" It's gotten to the point where she can't live alone anymore. Like, what do I do? Where do I start? Like, who do I talk to? And this string of rhetorical questions was a very common feature discursively in the accounts, and I think highlights their disorientation and lack of direction. And we see this again in the next quote, Elizabeth, in Margaret's account. She was also providing care for her father-in-law who had Alzheimer's disease and her ailing mother-in-law. She said, I want to find out about foot care. Do I go to social development? Do I go to public health? Do I go to her health insurance? Do I go to a home worker or to a private agency? You know, by the time you make all those phone calls, you might have an answer. It's scattered. There's no cohesiveness at all. Next slide, please. So the central complications, and I should say that I identified these complications first to then identify the organizational moment. These are all the daily complications that they experience. The first, inconsistent information, for instance, is they'll regularly encounter instances where one agency will say one thing and another says another. Services are fragmented and not coordinated. And even within the same service, there's notoriously high staff turnover. This is particularly a problem in home care agencies, in which it's common for staff to simply not show up for shifts, leaving caregivers scrambling to secure care so that they can go to work, for instance. And this resulted in many the participants that we talked to actually having to leave work because there was undependable care. Service providers don't get back to you when you're trying to ask for help. They speak in tongues, so we have system language here, using professionalized terms and acronyms that the public doesn't understand. And under my image is the word mistrust. So the lack of transparency and consistency in the system means that caregivers often don't trust the very system they are relying on. So while time doesn't allow to review each of these, I just want to share one quote that captures the feel of this first complication, inconsistent information. Next slide, please. When I interviewed him, Chris was really at his wit's end. His mother, who had had quite advanced dementia, had come to live with him, and it had progressed to the point where it was unsafe for her and actually for everyone in the home. He was trying to figure out how to get her into a nursing home, and in particular, what that costs. And so you'll see this in his quote. He says, you know, you go into these nursing homes, one group tells you one thing, another group tells you something else, you know, and you're never getting, you go to 4 homes and you're almost getting like 4 different answers, and then you're lost. And this feeling of being desperately lost, disoriented, and not knowing where to turn was a really common feature in participants' accounts. So next slide again. So again, just coming back to this slide, these are some of the central complications they faced. And before going on, I just want to pause here for a moment to remind us that what we're talking about here is care, often for a loved one. And when we look at these, aren't these the opposite conditions required for care? Where real care depends on conditions of consistency and relationship, responsiveness, understanding, and trust. And so the system is set up in a way that might well work for government or bureaucracies, but it actually produces a system at cross purposes to the very provision of care. And this is where a PSEC methodology was particularly helpful in seeing the connections between the daily complications and challenges in people's lives and how these are rooted in the overarching organization of the system. What was also really helpful was the next step in looking at how people make sense of and cope. So how did they manage these very complications? Next slide, please. And in the interest of time, I'm kind of combining 2 pieces of PSEC here, is how did they make sense of, which I'm understanding in terms of discourse, and how did they behaviorally cope with the system? So a central way in which they talked about coping with the system was through a fighting metaphor. And again, the contradiction of having to fight for care. To give you a sense of continuity here, I want to stick with Chris's interview. Next slide, please. And I just showed you the first quote that appears on the top of this slide there about him being lost. And here he's wanting to know about how much it costs to go into a nursing home, and he's just trying to find that answer. And very shortly after he says this first piece, he says, so basically I fought last week to finally get them to send it to me on paper. And that was probably after 3 different phone calls, 3 different emails, through the whole system. And then finally, I got it on paper. Next slide, please. And talk of fighting was unfortunately often also accompanied by talk of giving up. So last time, for continuity for Chris here, close on the heels of talking about how he fought with the system, Chris later described, I just came to a point where I didn't want to fight anymore. And to give you a sense of difference in terms of different participants, Carolyn said we just didn't want to go through the hoops anymore. And so people actually step out of the system. The opposite coping strategy to fighting was going silent for fear of retribution. Can you click, Elizabeth? Fighting is dangerous. Fighting with the system is dangerous, especially in a small rural area where there are no options if you burn your bridges. So speaking to this, Jennifer said, you can't burst into their office freaking out at them because it's not going to do you any good. If I do that, it's going to reflect on mom's care. And so there was a real sense of concern that if they complained or fought for the system, that would actually have a negative effect on their loved one's care. Next slide, please. And if you can click that forward. There we go. So not accessing services was actually another coping strategy, and this overlaps very much with discursive resource for making sense. This small but coherent code was marked by a very strong moral discourse that circulates in Canada of not overburdening our precious public health system. Interestingly, here, the system itself is positioned as in need of care in a way that is more important than the needs of the individual. Speaking to this, Amy said, I feel like resources in New Brunswick are tapped already in terms of like home support services, that I would hate to get her into the system too soon. And then she's taking resources from someone else. And finally, click please, help by crisis. As a result of being unable to manage the system, many don't get the supports that they need until they're in a state of crisis, and they end up in the emergency room, which remember is under the Health Act because hospital care is. And it makes sense that people do this because they have gone to emergency in states of emergency for their whole lives. So it makes sense that they end up there. Barbara described, she said, I said call an ambulance. We'll take her to the hospital because that was the only answer I had at that point when you can't manage it anymore. Oh, can you go back? And similarly, just back one. And similarly, Denise said she got to a point where she had to say, that's enough. So I said, call an ambulance. It's the only way. Interestingly, the complications of the system end up funneling people toward crisis and very expensive publicly funded care in hospitals. And this crisis of individual distress really is mirroring the crisis that we're seeing in our healthcare system, in which 1 in 4 beds in our largest city's hospital is occupied by an older adult waiting for placement in a nursing home. The average length of stay is 7 months, with some waiting 2 to 3 years. Not only is this a terribly expensive solution, but they're not getting the kind and level of care that they need because hospitals are not designed for this kind of care. This, of course, is harmful for older adults and caregivers, and it is also harmful for healthcare professionals, such as nurses, who often report being demoralized by the inability to extend this kind of care that they know is required. So ultimately, the result isn't working for anyone. So I'll just talk about the last piece here in terms of making change. So next slide, please. So what are we going to do with all of this? The final step in a PSEC process is taking action for change, and we're doing a couple of things here. One, we've developed this infographic and are bringing it to officials in government. We're also in talks to develop a verbatim theater to play in our community, to highlight this in our community. And next slide. And lastly, I'm involved in a second project based out of my university in which we're developing public education materials to help older adults and their caregivers navigate this opaque, disjointed system. So while we wait for political will to change the system, we're working on helping people figure it out now. So we're developing materials in English and French, website, infographics, pamphlets, and as well as videos that we're looking to have our gerontology and social work students at my university involved in as a part of their coursework. And so we launch this soon. And next slide. And so that is just a little bit about my adventures in learning this new methodology, which I'm finding tremendously helpful for unpacking this experience. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. I'm just going to take a moment to invite up our final speaker. So our last talk for today is going to be by Lucas Hofstetter. And his talk is titled Becoming a Carer as a Young Person, the Role of Service Access in the Construction of a Carer Identity and How to Talk About It via Zoom. Welcome, Lucas.
Hello. Thank you all very much for having me. I'm really thrilled to be part of this really great group of presenters. Just trying to figure out whether the screen sharing works for me. It seems to do so. Yeah.
Right.
Can you see the slides? Is that all right?
Yep, looking good.
Looking good. I just have to set up my screen in a way again that I can also see my notes and you. Just 1 second, please. Thank you, Jean and Elizabeth and all the other presenters, especially Michelle. Your findings are excellently translatable to the Australian context. It's shocking how similar these experiences are. And just thank you very much for introducing me to the psychosocial ethnography approach. I'm going to talk about something a bit basic in a way. I have the impression after all these great presentations. It's really about how young people start to see themselves as carers, develop something like a carer identity, and also a little bit how we talked about them via remote video. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm working or living. Here in North Sydney, it's the Gurrugal people of the Eora Nation. I would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the elders past and present, and extend that respect to every Aboriginal person who might have joined this conference. The findings and what I'm going to present comes out of a young carer research project, which we ran in Northern Hemisphere spring, so between March and June this year. It fell right into when Sydney went into lockdown, so we had to redesign the whole project to be instead of a in-person interview study, the whole interviews were conducted via Zoom. What was the background for this project? Young carers are often hidden carers. That means they're not identified as carers and they're hard to reach, which is a bit of a problem. We're talking about roughly 260,000 young carers in Australia, that is children and young people who provide care at home up to the age of 25. In New South Wales, the state where Sydney lies, there's roughly 84,000. That is one in every classroom among high school students. And as Zoe said, that's rather conservative estimates, precisely because they're hidden, because it's hard to identify them, and because they usually don't identify as carers themselves. Maybe I should say by carer, I always mean informal carer. Here in Australia, the term carer is defined as someone who cares for a family member or friend, unpaid and without any contractual relationship, unlike a volunteer or a care worker. Because care, as we heard from the other presentations, is very demanding in terms of time and energy, young carers often accumulate a lot of socioeconomic disadvantage in the form of higher school leaving rates, lower income due to lower ability to work, and long-term dependence on social security payments. This is why they are a priority group in the New South Wales Care Strategy, and why we, as an organisation representing carers, wanted to find ways to better engage with them. One other reason was that a lot of the information that we gather about carers in our constituency in New South Wales comes through a big survey that we conduct every 2 years. And we found that precisely, again, because they're hidden carers, they're really hard to contact and hard to connect with in the form of such a survey. So we decided to do this qualitative research project to really find out how to better engage with young carers and what the caring experiences of young carers are compared to others. How does identity come into play here? Just, you all know this, Stryker and Berg, 2000, there's 3 aspects to identity that are relevant to the concept of identity that are relevant in the context of this research project. One is the sociostructural aspect, that identity refers to behavior that is shaped by social roles, and identity is sort of the internalized role expectation that comes with being a carer. The more socio-psychological concept of identity refers to it as part of the self, composed of meanings attached to these social roles. And then there's a cultural, sociological aspect to the concept of identity, which is that identity is also an expression of an affiliation with a social category or social group. It expresses a sense of belonging, and marks someone as belonging to a common culture. This is less relevant in this context, but to some extent it plays a role as well, as you will see. So we use this concept of identity to understand sort of, or I guess the backdrop of the research question, when do people actually begin to understand themselves as carers and not as another social role? And what meanings do they associate with being a carer? Shortly, who did we speak to? In the end, it was 25 interviews and 3 interviews in the form of a focus group. The gender split was as we know, caring is coded predominantly female, so we had a lot more female respondents to our call than male. The age range we had started at 16. We couldn't find anyone younger, although the youngest respondent to our carer survey was actually aged 6. So we know that caring within the family often starts at very, very young ages. They were, interestingly, predominantly from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, as it's called in Australia. So they were speaking a language other than English in addition or predominantly at home. More than half of our respondents, and 3 of our respondents had an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander background. In terms of recruitment, we assembled our sample through snowball sampling, so word of mouth, through universities, high schools, established contacts that we already had through our young carer programs and through our support work. As I said, we conducted 21 interviews via Zoom, sometimes a few of them audio only, so more like phone interviews, and we had 1 Zoom focus group. How did we speak about this? We so our methodology followed roughly a bit of a grounded theory approach, although it would be a bit boisterous claim to say that we really followed that. Basically, we conducted open narrative interviews about the caring experience, how they became to be a carer, what supports they need, and what their life experience and their expectations from support services was. We analyzed our material through a rough thematic analysis, which is still ongoing. So it's a bit work in progress, which I'm presenting. Because I'm very conscious of time, I'll just start right with the findings. So I present you here with a few quick quotes how our respondents answered when they were asked about when it was that they realized that they were carers. So most started with an account of an experience of difference to their peer group. As you can see, for instance, the quote from Samantha, I think when you go over to friends' houses and you see them doing nothing compared to our lifestyle, just seeing that it was like, oh, we're not in a family that's normal, or we're not in a family that kids at the age of 10 are cooking and washing up and doing the washing. This is a very, very typical account that we got presented with. Usually the kids or the young people got eased into their caring role by helping around the household. First, the easier tasks like vacuuming, helping with shopping, helping with cooking. And as they progress in age, they take on more and more complex care tasks, depending on who they're actually caring for. So Samantha is caring for her mother, who has MS. A similar experience was described by Katie, who cares for a younger brother with Down syndrome. And she said, yeah, I was 6 when he was born, and just from primary school, when you talk to your friends about what they do at home, and it's just different from what you do, that's when you realize you're doing something different. The important point is that whilst what they're doing at home is perceived as not normal, so they either perceive themselves as not normal, or their family as not normal, or others as not normal, there is no real concept of care at first. That really enters their lives at a lot later. And the other important aspect is that they get really eased into the caring role gradually. And so it's a bit like the famous frog in boiling water. It's a gradual change and a gradual, someone said it's just a gradual piling on of tasks that you do for the recipient of care. And you don't even realize that you do something different to other people. Yes, it changes. These differences get highlighted, especially when there's transitions from high school, from primary school into high school, or from high school into uni, or from uni or high school into work. Through all this, their roles in the family continue, and usually and very often, depending on the condition they care for, but very often we found descriptions that they were slipping further and further into a caring role. However, the difference was highlighted with increased demands on behalf of the education system or work. And peer group changes is the other big factor that highlighted to our respondents the fact that what they're doing was more than being a daughter, being a brother at home. We found that that with the change of peer groups, for instance, by changing school, there was sort of a renegotiation of what was what the idea of normalcy entailed. As Katie again says, I probably heard it most when I transitioned to high school. When you talk to people and you talk about your family life, and then you tell them that you have a brother with Down syndrome who you care for, you'd start to get those comments of like, I don't know, some of them were almost borderline pity. What Katie here starts to describe, and what we found comes sort of at a stage, usually around high school age, is that caring almost gets, gets stigmatized in a way. Katie also, and I don't have the quote up here on this slide, Katie's very vocal about her caring role, and she even got interviewed for a news program here in Australia, where she described her experience of caring for her younger brother. And in reaction to that, she got approached at school by someone saying, "Oh, it's so brave what you do. If I had to do what you do, I'd kill myself." And Katie reacted very strongly to comments like this, and she was not the only one describing comments like this, because what young carers experience is a devaluation of their life in the eyes of their peer group. They're seen sort of as not normal, and the life they lead in providing care for a family member are not seen as worth living. And that's sort of the most extreme example that we had, but surely not the only one. What masks this very often is sort of a refusal to accept that anything is different. So as Helen, for instance, describes, who's a bit older and who cares for a mother with hearing loss and depression, and was caring for a father who suffered from a stroke and later passed away, was that it took a while for her to be convinced, or in quotes, it took a while for me to become convinced that I was a carer, because people sometimes at uni had mentioned that, and I was like, are you sure? Doesn't everybody help out around the family? And sort of this almost denial that anything is different is a very common obstacle to identifying as a carer. So to sum up, we've got a gradual increase of caring responsibilities. That is sort of a very common experience, and that goes hand in hand with an experience of difference with a peer group, and that establishes caring as not normal, as something that is not what normal people do. It is therefore connected to stigma, and also highlights that caring identity is not constructed within the caring relationship primarily, but rather in the conflict and in conflicting demands of the role as a carer at home and the demands of the education system or work or from the peer group. Further on, when we go towards how these young people actually realize that what they do has a name and that there's a social role which is described as carer, is that it really takes a while for them. But once they're realizing that the concept of carer describes what they're doing, they experience it almost as a relief. For instance, Sally, who cares for a father after stroke, says, I think that knowledge in being able to share my experiences with other people who were the same age was really helpful, because I used to think that there was some part of myself I was very alone in it. I felt like I was a little bit, in a way, I don't know, ashamed a little bit. So that shows that the stigma really is a part of the experience of being a carer. And Katie reacted to stigma differently. Katie really came out fighting, and Katie really challenged anyone who would give a shit about being a carer, to quote herself. Sally reacted more with withdrawal and with social isolation, which is also very common among carers generally. And Helen here describes in very, just like this quote very much, how the idea of being a carer and taking on an identity, identifying oneself as a carer, actually sort of, in her words, sort of validates that it's okay for things to be hard. It's okay that you're struggling with everything that everyone else seems seemingly doing fine with, because they're doing other things. And to go on, not everybody is staying up the night before until dad goes to sleep when they're having an exam. And it also means that she's not over dramatizing things. So the concept of carer really helps people to express their needs and express sort of their role in a separate way from the role as daughter or sibling. Mm-hmm. I'm going to rush through this a bit. What we found sort of gave way to what enabled the young people to identify as carers was very often also an outside influence. So it was mainly teachers, parents, support workers who helped and who told these young people, hey, what you're doing is actually more than just helping out around the family. You're actually what it is called a carer. That sort of brings them in contact with services. And that shows that services play an important role in not just mitigating the effects of being a carer, but finding a social role that allows them to express their needs and their situation. To sum it up, once they identify as being a carer, this has very conflicting meanings for the young people that we interviewed. On the one hand, it clarified their role expectations, and it made clear, or it allowed them to see themselves not just as a daughter, but as a daughter and a carer, or as a son and a carer, or a sibling and a carer. It also gave them permission to ask for help. So once you take on the identity of a carer, you're actually they felt more allowed to say, hey, it's not, I can't deal with that. Please help me with that. Can I get financial support? That also, of course, has a negative flip side, which is by identifying as a carer, they run the risk of identifying themselves as dependent, and many resist that. Many see that as an infringement on their independence, which ties into the last point on this slide, the bureaucratization that many fear and that prevents many from identifying as a carer. As I said, it's central for breaking isolation, for accessing support, and it is associated to some degree with a stigma. This is more the more broader conclusions we drew from our interviews, and goes beyond just the identity aspect. But as I said, identification is central for accessing services, for finding a way to organizing time, for separating out the often conflicting relationship with the care recipient in carrying out care. For instance, when you need your care recipient to do something, to help you with something that they resist, for instance, in the case of young people who care for a parent or grandparent with dementia, and sort of the loving, intimate relationship they still have, and that's still ongoing. And identifying oneself as a carer helps with that. Aaron, I see that I'm a bit over time. Aaron started with Jean Tronto. I'm going to end with her. So the bigger picture is that there's really a necessity to normalize care as something that is not necessary, shouldn't be the exception. Rather, it should be the norm. And we need to embed that in our modern institutions and organizations. I'm not sure that I can actually talk about the more methodological or method aspect now anymore. I'm gonna give over to you, Elizabeth, and maybe we can discuss. I can say a few words in the discussion. Is that all right? I can't hear you. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was really, really interesting. And thanks to all of our presenters. I'm going to invite everyone up to the stage. We're pretty close to the end of our scheduled time, but it would be nice to have a little bit of time for discussion and conversation. So those who can stay, please stay with us. I'm going to invite the presenters up, and we'll have a couple of minutes at least to talk together about some of the really interesting kind of cross themes that have been going on with this panel and that we have in common here.
Elizabeth just sent me a text message asking me to pose one question, the big question, to everybody. I'm like, but I have 8 pages of notes. I can't distill them in one question. But, and we really don't have very much time. But first, I'd like to say thank you to everybody. I have 8 pages of notes because I was just so taken up thinking about ways in which this abuts on some of my own research, which is not about carers, but about psychotherapists and their work, which is a form of caring work, and method, and on and on and on. So here's one question that I would like to ask to all of you. Did you hear anything as you listened to the other presentations? Did you hear anything that resonated with or illuminated something in your project? That you could take back and think, oh, I never thought of it that way, but now I will. I mean, for me, Michelle's the construct of organizational moment, which I'd never heard before. Oh boy, I thought, yeah, I want to go back and look at my data. But there were, lots of other things as well. The sort of assuming a caregiver identity and the pluses and minuses and so on. So I want to throw it open to you, you 4. If there's anything that you see as cross-cutting, or that you could draw on and make use of, or just think with from the other presentations.
If I can,
Yeah.
Sorry, Michelle.
It'll be really short because it's not well formed at all. But I'm the reluctance with which people identify as caregivers, I think, is really interesting, and I'm wondering about that juxtaposition between us identifying them as caregivers while they don't want to necessarily or don't identify as, and the ethics of that. And I don't know what to do with that, but I think there's something important and interesting going in there.
Yeah.
Zoe, I just talked right over you.
I think that's something I'm also grappling with. I just made a note of something you had, Lucas, around the bureaucratization of intimate relationships, and that just kind of got me thinking about this kind of reluctance maybe for people to change the dynamics of what is an intimate relationship to I guess, by taking on a caring identity or engaging with services or supports. There's that kind of, it invites that shift in what is often quite an intimate and personal relationship. So I thought that was a really interesting concept that you put forward there.
Mm-hmm.
If I can get back to that, Michelle and Zoe, I think for both, I think it's important. So us identifying them as carers. So the idea, what really became clear, I think, for me in doing these interviews was that, and I think that links well. And I was really great. Thank you so much for the, as Jan said, organizational moment. The caring identity itself only is relevant in the context of a capitalist, bureaucratic system where the value of one's life is measured in income. Everything else is sort of devalued, and where autonomy has a certain connotation as very classic Hannah Arendt, the oikos, it's separate, and only once the economic sphere is satisfied, you get to be something else. And I think that's what I wanted to get at with the last slide with John Tronto and with Michael Fine. That needs to change if we want to solve this crucible in a way. And I think the reluctance of being identified as a carer often comes from resisting sort of system impulses to be very, or the colonization of the life world to be very Habermasian about this. In this very, very practical way. I have to be that in order to get my sustenance, to get the time off study. I have to identify as that.
Mm-hmm. 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 I remember many, many years ago when Arlie Hochschild's early book about the double shift and the very different burden of housework and care work between men and women in heterosexual marriages. And I was talking about it with a friend of mine who thinks of himself as, the ultimate left, whatever, progressive thing. And he said, I don't like that book because it puts a metric out there and says that things should be divided equally, but this should be about love. And I thought, yeah, and do you do the dishes at home? Complicated. Yeah.
Interestingly, I don't know how so the Australian Bureau of Statistics does a great survey of carers as well. And what is found is that up to the age of 25, sort of the people who are identified as carers by that survey, the split between men and women is 50-50.
Really?
From the age of 25, it gets massively gendered, as we all know. And in old age, actually, there's a higher proportion of men providing care amongst their cohort than women. So I think that's demographically a very sort of obvious but interesting insight, that it is the world of work that intrudes into care, and we should start conceptualizing the world of work as intrusive rather than care intruding on work.
Right. Zoe, could I ask you a quick question? It struck me that it might be more difficult for people who are caring for someone with depression and anxiety, because, as opposed to a medical condition, that, well, you know, and I think this, I'm pointing at Erin, may sometimes be true with the beginnings of Alzheimer's. Like, you're not really sure you want to put yourself in the caregiver role because you don't really want that person to feel like you're putting them in this recipient patient, needing care. You're trying to do a whole lot of scaffolding and whatever to cover up their infirmities. I mean, I have the sense that happens, but do you?
Yeah.
Is that in there? And that's a whole other layer of complexity that somebody has to figure out how to negotiate interpersonally and for themselves. And the woman who said, I don't want to be a carer because it's going to kill the romance in my marriage. I mean, that was just a little frosting on the cake of what's a bigger problem. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, I think you're completely on the money. I think, like with many health conditions, but with many mental illnesses, there is that stigma, which, as we know, kind of perhaps creates an additional barrier for people when accessing services. And I'm not sure if I'm kind of blurring the stories that I was talking about today with some of the stories I heard in my work at Carers New South Wales, but that was often, I guess, a barrier for carers in accessing their own support, is the person they were supporting did not wish to seek support for themselves. And the way a lot of services and systems are set up in Australia, for carers to access support, they need to have identified someone that they're supporting, so they're kind of unable to take on that identity if there's no one to care for. So there's kind of that dependence there. And I think there was a lot, and I don't know if I had time to touch on it today, but this frustration in these accounts from people not knowing what it is they're supposed to do as a carer when it comes to anxiety and depression. What is that support supposed to look like? And I think that's often really hard when it comes to caring in the context of mental illnesses, these tasks that are maybe a little less kind of practical, or that might be associated in another caring role, can look quite different when it comes to supporting someone with depression or anxiety.
Well, and then you take the case of drinking. I mean, how are you going to think about alcohol abuse that's so severe it requires care?
Yeah.
I mean, are you going to be called an enabler if you provide care, by your therapist, and yeah, I mean, that's an even more complicated situation, I think, because you've got these different societal constructions. We can think of this as an illness, but we could also think of it as a moral failing, and and where does the person stand in that?
Before we wrap up, I just wanted to check in with Erin, because I don't know if you'd had a chance to share if you had a thought or reaction to one of our panels.
Oh, certainly. Yeah, I mean, again, I want to say that the organizational moment is really interesting to me, because it brings the individual and the system into the same analytic space very nicely, and so I really enjoyed that And I have a lot of questions for you about the history of why the system is the way it is in Canada, from south of the border, right? Where like we look at that as the system that works. And so this moment is very interesting to me. But I building off of what people have been saying recently, I think the thing that that really cut across all of these in an interesting way is the sort of meta pragmatic force of care and caregiving as a thing that both systems and people use in different ways. And the ethical conflict, not only that we feel as researchers or that individuals feeling themselves being drawn into caregiving identities might be experiencing, but really, the sort of discursive power of caregiving and or caring as a thing struck me in everybody's discussion.
Final words from any of you? Well, my final word is to say thank you to you all. It was just terrific to listen to you, and I hope we can bring you back when we sometime have a conference in person and you can all be there. Thank you. To the people who are listening, thank you. Thank you for joining us. If you want to listen to these pieces again, or tell your friends to listen to them, we will have them on, or teach them, use them for teaching in your classes. They will be on the SQIP website, squip.org. Not tonight, but very soon for you to listen to. So thank you all. And let me just take 1 second to invite the 5 of you and the 92 people who are listening to our next virtual salon, which is called Current Directions in Discursive Psychology. 3 speakers from the UK, who many of you already know, Laura Kilby, Chris McVitie, and Rahul Sambaraju, which is on December 7th from 4 o'clock in the afternoon to 5:30 Eastern Standard Time in the United States, where none of you are from. So please join us.
Great. Thank you, everyone. For those of you for whom it's nighttime, have a good night. For those of you for whom it's morning, have a great day, and hope to see you all at the next.
For those of you for whom it's tomorrow, sorry you missed today.
Hello from the
One over there.
From way far away. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.